The Christian faith is not about a galaxy far, far away. The whole thing is about God's story. What is God's story with humanity? I think a lot of Christians that don't love their Old Testament miss out on who Jesus is. Yeah.
How did we get the books of the Bible?
First of all, first and foremost, questions are awesome. So after Sunday, I'll usually get a bunch of questions, sometimes some challenges of, hey, have you considered this or thought about this or did you know about this? So one of the questions that came out of Sunday, and here's the thing, there are so many questions that come out of Old Testament history. Because
totally.
People devote their entire life to sections of this history for study.
Yeah.
I was talking to other pastors yesterday, and we were like, wait, hold on a second, which king is this, and where does this come in? And we said, this is why an entire study is Second Temple study.
Right.
So it's not even just, are you an Old Testament theologian? Are you a Second Temple? I mean, like this period of time, Old Testament theologian.
Yeah.
Because there's so much going on.
There's so much history going on.
One of the questions that came up that I thought was really a really insightful question was, in the timeline, we talked about them coming into the land. That's kind of the Moses-Joshua story. And then them having judges, which is their first kind of order of leadership to overcome adversarial countries. And then their rejection of God and then getting a king, Saul being the first, then David, then Solomon. And then the kingdom being split to northern, southern, kind of like states like we would have if the Civil War was won by the South.
Right.
And then we started talking about prophets that would come and speak to the northern kingdoms, or prophets that would come. So this is like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Hezekiah, Zechariah. And people were kind of confused that many of the prophets that we had placed were within or even before the north is in exile or the south is in exile.
Right.
And what they said was, okay, this is confusing to me because you're saying that Nehemiah, which I see in my Bible, is connected to right after First and Second Chronicles, is before the prophets in my Bible that are after Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. But you're saying that they're actually in reverse order, which I think what was happening in the question was, is my Bible, as it presents itself, in chronological order?
It's a really good question.
Like if I just pick it up in Genesis and I read through the Old Testament to Malachi, was that the chronological timeline? And the answer is no. So the Old Testament and New Testament is categorized like a library and saying, okay, the history books are in this section, the wisdom literature is in this section, and the prophets are in this section. And you actually, even within the prophets, like there's the major prophets and the minor prophets.
Is that because one is more important?
Yes.
Major or minors?
Yeah, that's not a good question, right? It's like, are they because they're important, major, minor being less important? No, it's just the size of the book.
Yeah.
So major meaning big book, big
You're going to read a lot of pages in this book. Yeah.
So it's going to be your Jeremiah, your Ezekiel, Isaiah. And then you're going to have minor prophets. And those are the ones that are hard to find, like Jonah. It's like, where's that book? I know it's sandwiched in here. So to their point, like you have to take a timeline that's histories that takes you through like Genesis through Nehemiah, and then you lay that out on a historical timeline, and then kind of above it or below it, however your brain works, you would say, okay, where are the prophets within that histories? Because they're dropping in on certain leaders.
Yeah, certain times in those history.
So maybe the way to think about it is like if you came to Calvary, you would see a history wall on the Boulder campus or Erie campus, Thornton campus, and then you would see pastors that have been a part of that history.
Right.
You could do the same thing with the prophets. Like you would take the history wall of Israel, and then you would put the kings, leaders there, as well as prophets, and where they are within history.
Yeah, and then the wisdom on top of that.
Yeah.
To sort of help instruct your hearts, warm your hearts to some things.
Even like where that came in, right? Because that comes in within history.
That's amazing.
So I think that's also really important. Like the Christian faith is not about a galaxy far, far away.
Right.
It's about the world that we have grown up in, that we've lived in, that has formed and shaped us in geographical locations with real people in time, in space and time.
Right.
And so it is a story of our histories. And whenever I think of the word history, I think of his story. So the whole thing is about God's story. That's why we call it history. So whenever you're reading history, it's God's story. So what is God's story with humanity?
And so Nehemiah happens sort of the end of what we know of the Old Testament history of, like, we got Genesis, the people of God, we have Abraham, his sons, his grandsons, we have Moses coming in, and then sort of Nehemiah is at the end of what we know in our scriptures of what the people of God were doing before the New Testament's written.
Yeah, so Nehemiah, even though it's located in the first third of your Bible,
Yes.
it's actually the last section of the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. So remember, it's cataloged by genre, so the histories. So Nehemiah is in the history section that's earlier in your Bible, but it's actually the last kind of setting the table, the scene for this 400 years of silence where they're back in the land and God has not sent a prophet, looking for a prophet, and then Jesus arrives on the scenes.
It's basically, if you believe that God is writing history, he is setting the stage at this moment for Jesus Christ and the gospel to all the world.
Yeah.
That's all he's doing.
Okay, so I know I'll mention this like probably several times on the weekends, but Nehemiah is rebuilding the gates that are burned and the walls. And Jesus is doing a lot of different kinds of ministries at the gates and by the walls.
So are the apostles in Acts.
Yeah, so you just think in your mind, okay, here's Nehemiah rebuilding the eastern gate that Jesus will come through in his triumphal entry.
About
like
400 years later.
Totally.
Yeah.
How awesome is that? Like, it's just like, wow. So that gate needs to be restored so that a prophecy would be fulfilled in Jesus entering the city through this place.
It's the beginnings of the world coming to the place in which Jesus can come in and go to the rest of the world.
Yeah. That's why I think a lot of Christians that don't love their Old Testament miss out on who Jesus is. That's where you get a little squirrely Jesus, because if you're going to know who Jesus is as the Son of God, the Christ, the one who is coming into the world, there has to be a context for that. There has to be a foundation laid for that. You have to have identifying markers of that's who God promised him to be. And so if you don't, and you just bring Jesus in, quote unquote, without the Old Testament, he just comes into a vacuum, and it's really hard to understand the fullness of who he is.
Right.
The Old Testament is Jesus Christ concealed. New Testament is Jesus Christ revealed. And you need both.